Now it is my honor to introduce our speaker, Jean Nordhaus. Jean is an award-winning poet who has published 7 volumes of poetry. She will today be discussing the book, The Porcelain Apes of Moses Mendelsohn, which was published in 2002. Jean is a native of Baltimore who studied philosophy at Barnard College and received her doctorate in modern German literature from Yale University. Jean served as review editor of Poet Lore for 8 years. Poet Lore is the oldest continuously published poetry magazine in the United States. Jean also served as poetry coordinator at the Folger Shakespeare Library. Sorry, I'm not reading well today. And was president of Washington Writers Publishing House. Jean has been a member of Temple Micah for over 2 years. With a last reminder to stay muted, turn off your video and keep your videos off, and post your questions to chat, I turn the floor over to Jean Nordhaus.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here. I miss your faces. I'm sorry you had to turn off, and I want to thank Barbara and David and Phyllis for helping to keep Lunch and Learn going in these pandemic times. While I know that Moses Mendelsohn is not as generally well known as his grandson, Felix Mendelsohn, he is an important figure to anyone who's interested in the history of Jews in Germany. And that is quite a complex and long tangled history. Moses, the grandfather of the Mendelsohn clan, was an 18th century German writer and thinker during the Enlightenment. He was the first Jew to publish a book in the German language and was the prototype for the character Nathan the Wise in the play of that name by Gotthold Ephraim Lessing. And he was the grandfather of Felix, not only of Felix, but he was the spiritual grandfather of Haskalah, which followed shortly after, and Reform Judaism. He was, really paved the way for the entry of Jews into secular society, into their acceptance, by his remarkable brain and his personal presence. That he was apparently a remarkable individual of great charm and tolerance and patience. And it's important that paved the way for Reform Judaism as well, but he remained traditionally observant all his life, although many Christians, given his fame, were eager to convert him. Anyway, I got interested in him in the course of doing some research on his granddaughter, Fanny, who was also a musician. And I came across a passage in a book about the Mendelsohn family that was written by Fanny's son, Sebastian. And this is the passage under Frederick the Great. Frederick the Great was the monarch during Mendelssohn's lifetime, and he was generally considered an enlightened monarch, but he was not at all enlightened with regard to his relationships with the Jews. There were all kinds of restrictions and ordinances that I learned about in the course of just reading about Mendelsohn and the family. And they, of course, were not citizens, were not allowed to be citizens. So this is the epigraph. Under Frederick the Great, every Jew had to purchase, on the occasion of his marriage, a certain amount of china from the newly established Royal China Factory in Berlin, and that not according to his own choice, but that of the manager of the factory, who made use of the opportunity to get rid of things otherwise unsaleable. Thus, Moses Mendelsohn, a man even then generally known and honored, became possessed of 20 life-size china apes, some of which are still preserved in the family. when I read that, I put the book down immediately. It struck me as such a wonderful metaphor for not only for anti-Semitism, but for all forms of hatred of racial and ethnic hatred, in which the perceived hate group are depicted as subhuman, bestial, animal. And I immediately started scribbling, and it became the impetus for a sequence of poems about Moses Mendelssohn and his work, which turned into a book. And so I'm going to go just really today, just go through my book and talk about him and read poems that are associated with various incidents of his life. And full disclosure, if there are any Moses Mendelssohn scholars among you, I am not. I hope you are not hoping for elucidation of any of the finer points of his philosophy. I kind of intentionally avoided diving too deeply into that, because what really interested me about his life was the legend, his story. Because his story really had the qualities of a classic folktale. Here he is, the classic folktale, the poor boy, the cripple, the disadvantaged, somehow by luck, by help, by talent, by magic, wins in the end, becomes a king, becomes a prince. So here is Mendelsohn. He was born in 1729 in Dessau, lived in the ghetto. His father was he was a sofa originally. He was the one who went door to door to wake people up and tell them to come to services. And his father later became a scribe, as did Mendelsohn for a while. He was born with a hump. He was sickly, he was small. Later, he was said to be quite homely, and he had a stutter, but he became, by the end of his life, one of the most famous men in Europe. And people came from all, his books were, his most famous book was translated into 30 languages, and people came from all over Europe and all over the world to visit him and to see this strange Jew from Berlin. So I am going to, he was a brilliant student, and he followed his teacher, David Friedlander, who was a noted scholar, was called to Berlin. And Moses, when he was 14 years old, followed his teacher to Berlin. So I'm going to start with my book starts with Moses Mendelssohn's entry into Berlin. At the time, there were 18 gates to the city, but there were only 2 gates through which Jews were allowed to enter, and those were the same gates that animals were allowed to enter through. He enters Berlin through the Rosenthal Gate. Far easier for a rich man to enter heaven. Say you've been walking for days, 14 years old, a brimming cup, away from Dessau and the ghetto, everything you know. You follow your teacher, a hunger, a love, with your bad shoes, a stammer, a slight hump. Will you be the camel that squeezes through? Suppose you've been walking all night and you come to that gate. All the rest are closed for you. New sun striking ancient stone, so bright it blinds. Now set a sentry in your path, a sphinx who questions you. Parable insists on this, though what she asks, what you reply, will not be told. And what to set above that portal on the doorpost of your story. How shall I enter, a Jew, through words, the smallest opening? May they be acceptable. In the Century Book of 1743 is written, "Today there passed through the Rosenthal gate 6 oxen, 7 swine, and a Jew." One of the things that so impressed me and caught me about Mendelssohn's life is that when he made his way in the world as a Jew, he did it as a writer and a thinker through his mastery, his ability with words. When he got to Berlin, he taught himself. He taught himself German, which was very much discouraged by the rabbinical powers. They didn't want the Jews learning modern German. And then he learned French, English, Latin, and Greek, and got caught up in the intellectual ferment of the Enlightenment. He supported himself initially. Initially, he was very poor, and he supported himself as a scribe. And later, he became a bookkeeper and became he became a bookkeeper in a silk factory and eventually became half owner of the factory. But this poem is about his early period in Berlin, and it's called The Weekly Loaf. Every week, I buy a fresh loaf of bread and score it with lines marking the 7 days so as not to feast now and go hungry by Sabbath. Then I go about my work with an eager mind. I brush my black pen through the words of others. I teach myself patience. I push through the pages at night, hunting glimmers and clues. If the mind can nourish itself, the strength of the body will follow. This I believe, as an answer must flow from the shape of a question, as the syllogism of the tree assumes the sun. Each man's life is a loaf he is given to hoard or spend as he will. But the mind is a chasm, an empty vessel, a rift in the earth a wind blows through. To feed this glutton, I am frugal. I busy myself with the law. I stint to make a generosity of what I am, a fullness out of want. The good Lord made the earth in 7 days. I carve these lines in the crust like commandments and follow them well, so as not to exceed each day's measure. At that time in Germany, German was not really considered a literary language. Germans who wanted to write literature, poetry, whatever, or philosophy, they either wrote in Latin or they wrote in French, which was that was the literary language of the time. And the Mendelsohn became involved with a group of young German writers and literary types who were promoting the use of German. So one of the reasons that Frederick the Great had a particular animus against him was that, against Mendelssohn, was that Mendelssohn reviewed a book of Frederick the Great's French poems. He wrote a volume of poems in French, and Mendelsohn castigated him for not writing in German. The book that made Mendelsohn famous was the Phaedon. It was a free translation of Plato's Phaedo, and of the dialogue. And Mendelsohn used the dialogue in many of his writings. It was a very congenial mode for him. And he expanded Plato's dialogue to include modern philosophical ideas from Leibniz and other contemporary or earlier philosophers, arguing that the soul he was arguing for the immortality of the soul on the basis that it's something that cannot be broken up into simpler elements. And he wrote the poem in just a frenzy of inspiration. He wrote the book in a frenzy of inspiration. This is how he wrote his Phaedon, or the immortality of the soul. It was simple. I was sitting in the courtyard of Herr Grab's house, waiting to deliver a bolt of silk, when it came to me complete, like a suit of clothing to the mind of a tailor before he cuts the cloth. Socrates, I thought, had not gone far enough. So I picked up the thread where he dropped it and followed it down through winding hallways to the underworld. There I found that ancient gadfly, homely and voluble as a crow, that son of a midwife, still bristling with questions. How could he begrudge the world a bit more talk? He who had died from the feet up. And so we nudged the thread along to weave a premise for the soul. No matter could be simpler. Before he swallowed his brimming cup of hemlock and was swallowed up again himself in folds of thought so dense I could not follow, he dropped a black feather, this quill I use to trace our conversation. 3 days of frenzy and the book was done. I had only to receive his words and write them down. It's harder, believe me, to love your neighbor or remember on your deathbed to repay a debt. I could remind you that Socrates' last words in the Phaedo were Crito, that before he died, he said, Crito, I owe a cock to Asclepius. Will you remember to return to repay the debt? So throughout his life, Mendelsohn preached religious tolerance, and he specifically avoided theological disputes, which would be very dangerous for a Jew in Germany at that time. But he was later placed in a very awkward and delicate position when a Swiss clergyman by the name of Johann Caspar Lavater, he was not only a clergyman, but a phrenologist. The sciences and philosophy and religion were all mixed up together back then. And I think he was a bit of a nut, but anyway, he wanted to make a famous convert. And so he he published a public challenge to Mendelsohn to either prove that the truths and miracles of Christianity were false, or else to convert. That he felt that the Christian religion was so irrefutable. And this, of course, was a minefield for Mendelsohn and unleashed a torrent of anti-Semitism at the time. Mendelsohn tactfully refused the challenge, but it was an emotionally devastating time for him. And he had a breakdown of sorts. He had a health problem, but I think he was also emotionally very despondent. And then afterward, when he started writing again, he devoted himself largely to Jewish matters. He published a German translation of the Torah, which was roundly criticized by the Orthodox rabbis, and they forbid their followers from reading it. And he also published a book called Jerusalem, where he expounded his ideas of Judaism as a religion that was a religion of law. It wasn't a question of believing a doctrine, but of obedience to laws, and that the Jewish religion was a religion consonant with natural religion, with a religion that you would come to even without miracles and volcanoes on top of mountains. So the next poem I'm going to read is an acrastic poem, and David, you can put up the image of the chess game now. Lavater first met Mendelsohn when he was invited to come and play chess. So I'll wait for the picture to come up before I read the poem. David? Yeah, there it is. Okay. A game of chess, two views, after a lithograph by S. Meyer. I have to say that when I spent a lot of time studying this image. The man standing at the top is Lessing, his playwright friend. The Mendelsohn is on the left and Lavater on the right. But what really fascinated me was the woman coming in from the kitchen. I'm always interested in the smaller details. A game of chess, two views. At first glance, Lavater and Mendelsohn confer above the board like warring fates. The yarmulke Jew and long-boned clergyman subsumed in shadows. Each man contemplates the field of light and dark squares, while a third, the playwright Lessing, coiffed like an English judge, presides with the disinterest of a god who hangs above the battlefield to watch. A woman with a tray steps through the doorway from the room beyond, her eyes cast down, not to spill a drop of tea or shake the cups. She must not interrupt, and they do not look up, because the Hebrew queen has seized Christ's knight and placed the king in check. Look closer now. They've pushed the board aside, an open book between them. Lavater leans forward, one hand on the page, the other on M's sleeve, as if he would persuade the Jew. Lessing, scowling, looks askance at Lavater. Only the woman remains as she was, with covered head and downcast glance, her figure graceful as an ampersand against the kitchen's light. In time, her firebrand daughter will ignite a conflagration with her passionate heart and rough contempt for custom. But tonight, the woman is intent on keeping balance, and her concentration never wavers from the task at hand. One of the ironies of Mendelssohn's life is that although he remained an observant Jew all his life, 4 of his 6 children converted to Christianity. Abraham, his middle son, was the father of Felix, and he probably converted in order to further the career of his talented son. But his oldest daughter, Brendel Mendelsohn, is now known to posterity as Dorothea von Schlegel. She divorced her Jewish husband. All of this happened, by the way, all of the conversions after Mendelssohn's death in 1786. But she divorced her Jewish husband, ran off with Friedrich von Schlegel, a German romantic poet and an important figure, a very important figure in German Romanticism. And she and her husband hosted a literary salon for the Romantics. And the Mendelsohn family, which has a family organization, or at least did the last time I looked them up, the Mendelsohn family has 2 branches, a Jewish branch and a Christian branch. So I'm going to close with 2 poems, one very short, about the end of his life. The Stranger from Dessau, and it has an epigraph from Mendelssohn's own writings. When things perish, they do not pass into nothingness, but are dissolved into their elements. The Stranger from Dessau. They called me Mendel's son, And yes, I was his son, but the Hebrew seal I set below my name read Moses, the stranger from Dessau. Strange things happen in this world. Gods are stolen, babies suckle into tyrants. But what could be less likely than a ghetto boy with twisted back and clumsy tongue to lead his landsmen from their gabled bondage? My father copied out inscriptions from the Pentateuch. They stuffed the phrases into tiny boxes, fastened them to door jambs, and above their eyes in prayer. My name is Moses. I was Mendel's son. I walked from Dessau with its tangled ghetto into Europe's glimmering age of light. And I am buried here among the shades, citizen of one republic darker than the pages of a book forever closed, dissolved into my elements, a mound of dust, a spill of bones, words bound in a narrow box. And what can be stranger than that? January 4th, 1786. There are many roads to prayer, but only one gate to the city, and I have passed through. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean. That was great. Ed, if you would unmute and activate your video, we can proceed with questions and answers. Everyone else can also, if they want, show their videos. It's up to you. And may I encourage people to please put some questions in the chat. We're giving Ed a hard day with very few questions coming out from the group. So Ed?
I'll start off with something that Barbara Diskin talked about. Her first question was Moses alive when Felix left Judaism, which you answered? And talk a little bit about the family, because it's an interesting family. You had talked somewhat about the grandchildren, but I'm curious about the other parts of the family you might be able to tell us.
Well, most of them, the one I know most about is Brendel, who was Abraham and Brendel. Those are the ones who've been most written about. I think the brother Joseph was one of the two that remained religious. And he and Abraham eventually had started a banking house together. So that branch of the family was wealthy, I think, eventually. And there was one other daughter who did not convert, and all I know is that she was unhappily married, and I really don't know too much about what became of the other children. But the Abraham household was, well, the Mendelssohn's own family. His marriage was very happy. He married a woman named Fromet, who was, she was from a very good family in Hamburg. And although she was not good looking, well, one of the myths in the family was that she was shocked when he came courting, but he told her that he had taken the hump, that before she was born, God had taken the hump, and Mendelsohn had taken it on himself so that his Fromet could be beautiful. I know that he and Fromet did converse in a combination of German and Yiddish, and that he insisted that she learn French because you needed French to live in Berlin and sort of move in Berlin society. But that it was a long and happy marriage. Several children died, as so often in families that time, and he wrote movingly about the death of his first daughter at 11 months. And so they lost 4 children and 6 survived, and 2 remained Jewish. So.
Fascinating. There were some questions about the apes that were raised in here, how big they were, what has happened with the porcelain apes?
Yeah, it's very interesting when first of all, I have to tell you that after I published the book, a friend of my son's who is an ardent, a very serious publisher said, well, I should go find the apes, and that I would get a lot of publicity for this book if I went to Germany and found the apes. Well, first of all, it turns out that this story is apocryphal for several reasons. There were apes in the Mendelsohn household. That has been reported as true, but they were apes that he wanted and that he bought himself. And they were Meissen. They were from Meissen, the Meissen factory, which Frederick the Great's royal porcelain factory was trying to emulate. But the Juden Porzelane, as they were called, the Jewish porcelains, were of lesser quality, and they came from the royal factory. But the regulation was not passed until after his marriage, so he could not possibly have had to buy the porcelain on the occasion of his marriage. And I don't really know the size of them, but I think we've all seen these little figurines. The Meissen, I don't know the size of them. The Meissen factory did were very famous for a whole series of Jewish musicians. They made a Juden orchestra, a Jewish orchestra, out of these ceramic porcelain figures.
And I would personally recommend visiting the Meissen factory if you are in Germany. They've been producing porcelain for centuries now and are still producing it in all shapes, sizes, so that the apes were just one of a sort of a menagerie of different creatures whom they do. A couple of other questions. Sid asks, how did you find your way into poetry, and what inspired you to do this path?
Well, as someone said to me, when I first went back to work after my children were old enough to leave, I was teaching German at what was then Federal City College, and I left and I met a colleague, and I said, she said, what are you doing now? And I said, well, I'm writing poetry. And she said, doesn't everybody? So, but certainly I wrote poetry as a child during the years of my education. It was sort of too forbidding to write poetry because I was always, all my life, fascinated with language. My whole family, we were a family of talkers. And but when I got to college, and I wrote an epic poem when I was in 6th grade about the wind. But when I was in college and graduate school, poetry was written by very intellectual white men, and women weren't writing. And then suddenly women started writing, and I went to hear a few people, some of whom are here today, Linda Paston and Myra. And I said, oh, I think I can do that. And I started writing.
And then one of the questions someone asked is, were these all written during one period, or were they separate and sort of collected? This is in terms of the volume you've been talking about, the Porcelain Ape volume.
They were written really over a period. I think it took me about 5 years to get the book together. And my original conception of the book was, I was just going to write a poem about each of his disadvantages, a poem about his hump, and a poem about his stutter, which I did. But of course, then the whole thing expanded, and the more I read about his life story, and I just worked on them. No, I didn't work on a lot of other things at the same time, and they were not scattered. It was a very sort of intense period of my life. And Mendelsohn was I loved being able to write in his voice, because as an 18th century, I could say lots of old-fashioned, unstylish things that, so it made it easier to. to express my own ideas.
Is there, one of the questions was, is there a book you would recommend about Mendelssohn, Moses Mendelssohn, and or his interesting family history?
Well, the Mendelsohn family, the book by his grandson, is very good reading, but you have to take some of it with a grain of salt, because it's just full of old family stories, some of which are apocryphal. But a wonderful book to read about Jews in Germany, and many of you probably already know it, is Amos Elan's The Pity of It All. There's a book by somebody, his last name is Altman, which is a biography, but it's very, very deep in the weeds of 18th century philosophical disputes. So it's not exactly easy reading. So, but the Mendelsohn family is the one I know of best. So.
And is there any relationship between the Porcelain Apes and the song in the cabaret musical?
I don't know. Ed sent me the song last night and I looked at it. It's hideous. It's quite horrible, but only that anti-Semitism permeated it, and the edict, the story is a way of encapsulating the idea of anti-Semitism and Jews being considered apes. And of course, if you look at some of the Nazi propaganda drawings of, if you go to the Holocaust Museum and see some of the Nazi propaganda depictions of Jews, often they look like rats. You know, that to depict the enemy as an animal is sort of typical.
Nancy Raskin asked, can you speak more about how Moses was received by the Jewish community in Germany during his time, and that how that might have influenced periods after him?
Well, he was very helpful to the Jewish communities of his time, because one of the things he did, he was involved with, particularly during the second half of his life, was in using his prestige to help Jewish communities who were in conflict with the authorities for one reason or another, to work out their problems. And in the fact that he was seen as, this one was fascinating, because there was, I can't remember the community that was having the problem, but Jewish law says you have to bury someone within 24 hours. And there was an edict that you were not allowed to, you had to keep the corpse for 3 days before burial in case it was still alive. Ooh. And somehow, yeah, it was pretty horrible, but Mendelsohn, met with the counselors and the people involved, and they managed to work it out. And the Jews were allowed to bury their dead immediately. They worked out a compromise, as we hope people are working out in the Congress these days. And I think that for the most part, the Orthodox were, of course, appalled, and they did not at all approve of his participation in the Christian world. And that was, and to this day, the Orthodox do not think positively of Moses Mendelssohn. They see him as a precursor of what happened in Germany, and that the supposed assimilation ended so horribly during the Holocaust. So I think there were mixed feelings back then, and there are some mixed feelings today.
And Barbara Goldberg asks, what theological issues did this story or your writing allow you to explore more fully, like the nature of soul, the holiness of words, without getting into his philosophy or his intellectual philosophy, whether near aspects of that you identified with, or?
Barbara, that's a hard question. No, I think it was less theology than identity. I mean, I identified so much. I grew up in a voluntary ghetto. I grew up in a neighborhood where everybody was Jewish. I grew up in Baltimore, Northwest Baltimore. I don't think I knew anybody who wasn't Jewish throughout my childhood. And I was very eager to go off, uh, to leave the neighborhood. Everybody knew everybody else. It was like a small town, and I wanted to go out into the world. So it was more. And then I went off to college, and I married someone who was only half Jewish and not the least bit interested in religion. And my own religious upbringing had been Reform, secular, and my parents were not a bit interested. They just sent us off so that I was confirmed. But in a way, the Mendelsohn book sort of brought everything together for me. You know, it was a coming back to identifying myself and realizing how deeply Jewish I was, whatever else I knew or learned or did. And it was also enabled me, you know, I had studied philosophy, I studied German, none of it seemed to make much sense. And here I was in a city where everybody was only interested in politics and everybody was a lawyer. And this suddenly brought so many things that had interested me all my life together. So it was less theological than on a more personal level.
Did that change your view in terms of doing other poetry? Meaning that how did this influence you published other poetry as well. How did this impact your subject choice or description or other things with your later poetry?
Well, I'm not sure that it really did. It was such a wonderful time when I was working on these poems because I could sit down every day and know what I was going to write about and know what I was going to do. And it must be what it's like for a novelist, that you have a longer cohesive thing that you hope that's cohesive that you're working on. And I didn't have to sit down every day and wonder, say, what should I write around today? Or do I have anything to say today? So this was a fairly discrete project for me. I did write other poems during that time on other subjects, but I kept coming back to this, and nothing quite like it has happened to me since. So,
David Diskin asks, and I think this is, are there other famous Jews in the Jewish part of the family up until the present? I assume this is after Felix and Fanny, who are, although they changed their name too, but what about the family since after Moses?
we don't really know too much about I don't think there is anyone who has achieved, you know, I'm sure there were people who were able bankers and in all kinds of professions, but I have not researched that, and I don't know of anyone who has achieved the kind of fame that Felix did. Fanny was a very good musician, but and Felix was very close to her and was devastated by her death. But the family, she was not encouraged to have a musical career. Women were not allowed to have a career outside the home. And so she did not, although in their home, they had musicals all the time. And the family entertained and they performed, yeah.
And Francie asks, how do you think the family viewed Moses, meaning that he had a larger family, he had 6 children, and then they grew. How did they view Moses from their perspective? I recognize it's outside of the.
Yeah, I don't know of anything that they have written. Well, first of all, they have stayed a family and banded together, so there has to have been great pride in their distinguished forebears. And they do have a family organization that's, you can look them up on the internet, or at least haven't done that recently, but you could. And I can't imagine that they are not proud of their forebears. One other famous descendant, not all that famous, but Dorothea's son, Dorothea became a devout Catholic at the very end of her life. I think she may have been a little bit of a nut too. And her son by her first marriage, Philip Veit, became a painter and he was a very conservative Catholic painter. He became Catholic too, and is very well known in among Christian painters.
And Barbara Diskin had asked, was the family as wealthy in sort of Moses's lifetime?
I think they were comfortable. Yes. I had an uncle who used to joke about the uncomfortable, but yes, I don't think they were tremendously wealthy. I think they became wealthier in Abraham's time, but in Moses' time, I think they had a nice household and they entertained, and they kept kosher. And Moses observed all the kosher laws, and there was much banter between him and his friends about his observance of the laws, which he handled well. But I don't think they were fabulous. They were not fabulously wealthy.
But I assume, how did he respond to the end? I mean, he had responded. What do you think, in terms of responding to the anti-Semitism of his time and that period, how would you characterize his sort of response for this, especially compared to others?
Well, there is a story. He knew Kant, and I did not mention, but he was earlier in his career, before he became famous and wrote the Phaedon, he engaged with Kant, and he engaged in the Royal Academy offered a prize, and a prize. He wrote a prize essay on the subject of whether metaphysical truths could be proven the way mathematical proofs were, and if they couldn't, what was the certitude? How could you prove metaphysical truths? Anyway, he wrote a paper on this subject. This was the published subject for the contest, and Immanuel Kant wrote a paper on the subject, and Mendelsohn won first prize, and Kant, they were in very close contention, but Kant got the second prize, and was commended. And there was a story that he went to visit the city where Kant was at the university, and went to attend a lecture. This was before he had ever met Kant. And he went into the room, and he was dressed as an Orthodox Jew, and all the young students hooted and howled and made a horrible noise about it. And he very quietly walked in, sat down in a seat toward the back quietly, and then when Kant came in and started lecturing, the uproar quieted down, but the students were very, very abusive, and wanted to try to get him to leave, and he refused to leave, but he sat quietly and with dignity. Everyone said he had enormous dignity. And Kant gave his lecture, and the students were then astonished when Mendelsohn came up afterward, and Kant recognized him and shook his hand, and then all the students said, "Oh, this is the Jew Moses Mendelsohn," and suddenly they were mollified and respectful. But I think he just conducted himself with as much dignity. He certainly didn't try to fight or to fight back.
And we're almost out of time. I have one or two more questions. Nancy Raskin asks, Wikipedia calls him the German Socrates and the German Plato. Can you speak to this in terms of how he was viewed then, and perhaps how he might be viewed now, although the second part might be more of the intellectual side?
Yeah, well, I think to some degree the Phaedon, the poem that I read about Phaedon, more or less tells you that he adopted the dialogue form, and he used that dialogue form throughout. And of course, the Platonic dialogues are all the Platonic dialogues are all dialogues between Socrates and his students, and Mendelsohn carried on this tradition. And how he is viewed today, I think he's not viewed as a major metaphysician. I think he's more viewed for his. At the time, he was very respected among men of letters and in the world of the philosophers. Today, philosophy has moved on, and academics have moved on, but there are still people who study him very seriously, and I do not know actually what his legacy has been in Jewish letters. I'd be interested to know that if there are people among you in the audience who are knowledgeable about that.
Well, two different things. One is the downtown discussion group, which is not downtown, but is a discussion group that also meets on Wednesdays, has been reviewing a book, and maybe Alan Carpian can recite the name, in which Moses Mendelssohn's views in terms of Reform Judaism were very much of a special period. He was almost the father of sort of Reform Judaism. As Barbara Diskin wanted to note, this is a full book here of her poetry. I should note, just as a curiosity, her book of poetry was translated into Hebrew by Moshe Dor. And the Hebrew poetry group may be studying in a bilingual fashion how they managed to convert over this fascinating volume into Hebrew. I think I'm almost out of time. Let me see if I've got one more question here, or two more for that. So that's a copy of the book. Phyllis has posted a number of potential questions for the breakout discussion groups. I've forwarded to everyone an interesting Wikipedia citation that Robert Seasonwine has posted about the popularity of monkeys as a theme, and anyone who's seen collections of porcelains, they're actually gorgeous. I wouldn't call them a grotesque, but they're very interesting because these animals have quite a bit of character to them. And obviously the monkeys are one which is both a popular subject and one in which you can add a lot of character. Jean, any closing thought? Fast closing quote. What are you working on these days?
I'm putting together a chapbook of poems and working to I'm putting together very slowly a new volume of poems, I hope.
Well,
we look forward
until it's done.
Well, that's a wonderful way to close this part of the presentation. We're going to look forward to that, Jean. That sounds great. So first of all, thank you, Jean, for an excellent presentation. And thank you, Ed, for stepping in today as moderator and doing a great job. Jean, we can't thank you enough for sharing your scholarship, your poems, and wonderful metaphors with us, and helping to better understand the importance of the German Jewish writer Moses Mendelssohn in 18th century Germany and what he means for us today. Kudos to you. Though we remain muted, I know that all the participants here today join me in giving you a rousing round of applause. Thank you, really, today for your wonderful presentation. I'd also like to thank David, Francie, Barbara, Jerry, and the entire Lunch and Learn committee for all the work that you do. Thank you as well to our visitors and first-time attendees today, and hope you will join us again.